This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Natalie Edwards. Tonight's top stories. A message of peace and a show of force. President Xi Jinping met Taiwan's opposition leader, warning Beijing will not tolerate independence, even as Taipei says that Chinese warplanes crossed the median line. Now, Islamabad is under virtual lockdown ahead of US-Iran ceasefire talks. Attention is also turning to China, seen as a possible key guarantor of any eventual peace deal. Meantime, Japan confirms a second release of fuel from its reserve from May. Well, South Korea's ruling and opposition parties agree on a supplementary budget to shield homes and businesses from rising oil costs. And China's factory prices snap a 3-year deflation streak, signaling that war-driven energy shocks are starting to feed into production costs. Also in the bulletin, oil-driven price spikes are hitting China's manufacturers, squeezing margins, snarling logistics, and triggering panic buying in the country's largest plastic hub in Guangzhou. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Taiwan's main opposition leader, Cheng Li-wun, affirmed the need to maintain peace across the Taiwan Strait. This as the pair held talks in a rare meeting in Beijing. Well, Ms. Cheng is in China on a 6-day visit for what she calls a peace mission, at a time when Beijing ramps up pressure on the self-ruled island it claims as its territory. Now, at the meeting in the Great Hall of the People, Mr. Xi said that people on both sides of the strait are part of one family that seeks peace and development. But he also struck a firm tone, warning that China will, quote, absolutely not tolerate any move towards Taiwan independence, which he described as the main threat to stability in the region. Now, Ms. Cheng also echoing those sentiments, urging Beijing and Taipei to work together to, quote, avoid war. Well, for more, let's bring in CNA correspondent Crystal Chia live from Shanghai. Crystal, so all in, what was being said at the meeting between Cheng and Xi?
Well, the rare meeting started with a long handshake and then saw both sides stress their desire for cross-strait peace. President Xi said that despite the international landscape, the two parties are meeting to safeguard their shared homeland. He also said that China was willing on the common political foundation to work with various parties, including the KMT. Let's have a listen.
今天的世界并不太平。 和平弥足珍贵，两岸同胞都是中国人，一家人，要和平，要发展，要交流，要合作，这是共同心声。两党领导人今天见面，就是为了维护我们共同家园的和平安宁。
So throughout Cheng's trip so far, when she made remarks at various stops, she kept repeating the idea of peace, saying that her visit will help to bring peace as a gift to the people in Taiwan, and that the two sides do not need military confrontation. Now, following the meeting with President Xi, the KMT held a press conference that lasted about an hour, and here's what she has to say.
我们当然要与时俱进的，透过不同的语言。 或者是与当下契合的表述的方式，让每一代的年轻人都了解，在这个阶段我们面临的是一个什么样的挑战，而如何透过9·2共识跟反对台独来避免战争、避免悲剧，来携手缔造和平，在和平的基础上谋取人民最大的福祉。
So, Crystal, tell us a little bit more about the context behind this meeting and what exactly has Cheng been doing in China so far? Because I believe she still has 2 more days left in the country, doesn't she?
Yeah, so Cheng is the KMT's first sitting leader to visit the mainland in about a decade. The question about whether she was going to have this meeting was one that has dominated the entire visit ever since she landed on Tuesday. And it wasn't really confirmed until yesterday that she was going to have this meeting. So throughout the week, she was also in Nanjing, where she paid a visit to the Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum. And she was also in Shanghai, where she visited Meituan and interacted with Taiwanese youths, with Shanghai having the highest concentration of Taiwanese businesses. For the rest of this trip, this evening, she will attend a performance at the National Center for the Performing Arts. She's expected to stay in Beijing tomorrow. We are unsure of her schedule yet, and she will depart on Sunday.
Appreciate this update. CNN correspondent Crystal Chia speaking to us live from Shanghai. And we're going to be bringing you more cross-strait relations insights later this hour when we chat with Sean King, Senior Vice President at Park Strategies. Pakistan is preparing to host talks between U.S. and Iranian officials to negotiate an end to the 6-week war. Now, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance will be leading U.S. team of negotiators. Reports say the Iranian delegation will be led by the parliament speaker, as well as the foreign minister Abbas Araghchi. Islamabad is in a state of virtual lockdown. A holiday has been declared. Schools and colleges are shut. Police checkpoints have been set up across the city, with several entry points into the capital closed. Now, Pakistan's Ministry of Interior has granted a blanket permission for international journalists to obtain visas on arrival. The upcoming talks are once again casting a spotlight on Pakistan's role as a key intermediary in the conflict. Islamabad has close ties with Washington and has also been one of its major non-NATO allies since 2004. Its ties with the U.S. have strengthened since U.S. President Donald Trump returned to office, with the two signing a rare earth deal. Pakistan also has long-standing relations with Iran. They share a border. And despite occasional skirmishes, Tehran and Islamabad have maintained close cultural and religious ties. Our eyes will also be on China, which Iran has requested to serve as a security guarantor. Beijing maintains close ties with Islamabad, with both sides describing their ties as that of, quote, ironclad brothers. The AFP news agency, citing the chairman of the Pakistan-China Institute, who's a former senator, saying that Beijing's role would be indispensable for any final peace agreement, with both sides having been closely coordinating from the war's outset to end hostilities. Well, East Asian economies, in the meantime, are rolling out more measures to address the worsening fuel crunch triggered by the war on Iran. Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi confirmed today that Tokyo would release an extra 20 days' worth of state oil reserves starting May. It will be the second such release since the start of the war. Now, Japan imports around 95% of its oil from the Middle East. Last month, the government also tapped 15 days' worth of private sector petroleum stockpiles to plug shortages. South Korea's ruling Democratic Party and main opposition People Power Party have reached an agreement to pass a bill on supplementary budget, and that's aimed at easing the burden of rising oil prices on households and small businesses. Well, the size of the package remains unchanged from the government's initial proposal of $17.7 billion. The National Assembly will be holding a plenary session to process the bill. South Korea's finance minister has also urged officials to stay vigilant, warning that uncertainty still looms, even with a ceasefire between U.S. and Iran. Now, in Hong Kong, authorities are proposing short-term measures, including diesel subsidies of about 38 US cents per litre and reduced tunnel tolls to ease pressure on the commercial transport sector. The government says proposals will need funding approval from the Legislative Council, as well as coordination with the service provider of tunnel fee e-payment system. And for more of our coverage of the war in Iran, do log on to cna.asia or our mobile app for commentaries such as this one you're seeing here on how Tehran is seen to have emerged stronger based on the nature of the ceasefire. We're going to go for a short break now, but coming up on East Asia Tonight, War risks in the Middle East threaten Asia's growth into next year, the ADB warns, while the IMF signals a global downgrade ahead. Plus, TSMC market-beating earnings underscore resilient AI demand despite Middle East war risks. Hello again. Good to have your company this Friday evening. It is now time for business news with none other than Roland Lim. And Roland, we've got new data apparently showing that China ended a deflationary streak as far back as 2022.
Right you up. China's factory gate prices have finally turned positive. But it's not booming because of demand that's driving it, rather the oil shock from the Middle East conflict that's impacting input costs. China's latest March deflation figures show that factory gate prices rose for the first time in more than 3 years, an early sign that cost pressures due to the Middle East conflict is mounting for the world's second-largest economy. Producer Price Index rose 0.5% from the previous year, slightly beating estimates. This is the first rise recorded in 42 months. Energy-heavy industries were the hardest hit, with producer prices surging as well. Analysts say strong price cutting by businesses had contributed to this figure in a phenomenon widely known as involution. On the consumer side, the price index eased in March, rising 1% from the year before, missing economists' forecasts. Some analysts say that during a cost-push inflation cycle, businesses cannot fully transfer rising costs to consumers and must partly absorb it, which puts pressure on profits. The consumer price index on a monthly basis was down 0.7%, coming below estimates. China is the only Asian economy which has recorded such a decline in the month of March. Now, we are seeing positive moves in the Greater China region as stocks did move high. All the three majors, Shanghai Composite, Shenzhen Component, and the Hang Seng Index in Hong Kong, are lit green. South Korea's central bank has kept its benchmark lending rate unchanged at 2.5% in a unanimous decision, extending a pause that has been in place since July of last year. The Bank of Korea flagged both the risk of resurgent inflationary spiral fueled by crude prices and slower growth. South Korea's Kospi index high by around 2% before and after the decision. The Korean won has also largely unchanged after the announcement. It is weaker, though, against the greenback by 0.6%. Checking in on markets for the rest of the region, both the Nikkei 225 in Japan and the Taiwan weighted index on the front foot, ending the trading day up, respectively 1.9% and 1.6%. The Asian Development Bank, or ADB, expects rising geopolitical risks from the conflict in the Middle East to slow growth for developing Asian economies this year. In its latest report, ADB expects regional growth to come in at 5.1% this year from 5.4% in 2025. It also warns that further escalation in the Middle East conflict could further weigh on growth next year. ADB sees inflation hitting 3.6% this year. It's amid rising energy prices due to oil supply disruptions. And that's higher than the 3% price growth last year and more than double their 1.6 estimate back in December. Asia's direct trade links with the Middle East has left it exposed to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Supply disruptions of oil, fertilizers, and key gases such as helium have raised production costs in the agricultural and manufacturing sectors. The conflict also disrupts aviation links between Asia and Europe, which will weigh on tourist-dependent regional economies. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, is also set to cut global growth forecasts amid the conflict in the Middle East. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said that they expect an increase in demand for financial support as the war tests the global economy.
We cannot go through it without some pain. Policymakers can help to reduce this pain in multiple ways. And Certainly, one way in which they can help is please don't make matters worse. So I appeal to all countries to reject go-it-alone actions, export controls, price controls, and so on, that can further upset global conditions. Don't pour gasoline on the fire.
Ms. Georgieva said that the IMF expects near-term demand for up to $50 billion in support. She noted permanent scarring effects from the war in the form of infrastructure damage, supply disruptions, and the loss of confidence. Oil prices climbing as strikes on Saudi facilities raised anxiety. Both the Brent crude and the U.S. market West Texas Intermediate trading closer to the $100 per barrel mark. Prices remain elevated as Iran stoked concerns about ongoing restrictions to energy flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Tanker traffic through Hormuz fell to below 10% of normal volume on Thursday, according to ship tracking data. Reports suggest that Tehran is demanding the right to collect tolls in the strait as a precondition for reopening the waterway vital to world oil supplies, some pinning the figure at $2 million per vessel. Now, it's a move fiercely opposed by U.S. President Trump. A scramble for oil cargoes as Iran chokes the Strait of Hormuz is pushing North Sea prices to record highs. Physical barrels for June delivery are trading well above Brent at $97 a barrel, highlighting a worsening global energy crunch, despite U.S. assurances that Tehran will reopen the strait. The Forties blend, that's one of the largest oil fields and a benchmark for immediate delivery, had hit close to $147 a barrel this week. This surpasses the highs reached on the eve of the 2008 financial crisis. TSMC's latest quarterly report card reaffirming global AI chip demand remains unaffected by the Mideast conflict, at least for now. The world's largest contract chip maker reporting its first quarter revenue of $35.7 billion, and that's up 35% on year and beats market forecasts. It'll report full first quarter earnings next week, including an updated outlook for the current quarter and the full year. TSMC, whose clients include NVIDIA, has been a major beneficiary of the AI boom. Its shares closed up 2.3% today. They gained more than around 26% so far this year. Shares of Uniqlo parent Fast Retailing rising to a record after the Japanese clothing retailer raised its full-year outlook. Now, it forecasts operating income of some $4.4 billion compared to the previous guidance of around $4 billion for the fiscal year through to August. Uniqlo reported a rebound in revenue and double-digit profit growth in the first half of this year after a slump in China a year earlier. The result also came as Uniqlo expands its presence in the U.S. Disruptions to the flow of oil have not only caused an energy crunch in Asia, they're also spilling over to plastic production.
This is Zhangmutou, also known as China's Plastic City. Located east of Guangzhou, China's largest plastic trading hub has been feeling the sting of rising oil-linked costs driven by the Iran war. Plastic prices have risen sharply, squeezing margins, disrupting logistics, and fueling panic buying across the supply chain. Peng Xin, the general manager of a firm that manufactures plastic pellets, says costs have surged by about 60% since March. He also says his factory's safety stocks have been depleted with new raw materials being bought at elevated market prices, costs that he says would soon trickle down to customers.
然后，对于我们这种改进工厂，就是我们年前都会备一些安全库存，就是年前不管是平时我们也备一些安全库存嘛，是不是？但是我们的库存已经基本上已经生产完了，已经出货了，所以现在我们所有的产品都是所有的原材料都是高价按照实际价格，现在的价格高价回来的，所以我现在整体马上会反映到下一个客户那里去， 这个价格这么高，下游客户的说实话也是压力也是比较大的。
Zheng Bin, marketing manager at an online trading and pricing platform for plastic raw materials, said firms have been stocking up in preparation for a longer-lasting Iran war.
中东局势的这个1-2个月的有可能不会缓和的这种情况下，造成大家心里的这种恐慌，还是会去积极的去备货。而上游石化厂他们没有这个原油，没有这些单体来生产的话，他们也是只能是被动的去抬高他们的这个价格。
The rush to secure supplies has also clogged warehouses and roads. Warehouse owner Han Bing says this year is the busiest year he's ever seen, with daily turnover doubling to about 1,000 tons from around 500 tons previously.
最火爆的时候就是3月5号以后，就是几乎差不多在1个礼拜之内，樟木都全部堵车，堵车超过差不多10公里到15公里，啊，就是每个仓就是爆仓满仓，啊，进出都受到很大影响。
China is the world's largest plastic producer, consumer and exporter of final plastic products, according to a 2025 report by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
Meanwhile, voters in Hungary head to the polls on Sunday, and Beijing is watching closely. Hungary is one of China's key gateways into Europe, pulling in about a third of its investment in the region, from electric vehicles to battery plants. Now, that axis has been driven by Prime Minister Viktor Orban's pro-Beijing stance. But if the political balance shifts, a new government could take a tougher line, putting Chinese investments and its foothold in Europe at risk. Ross Cullen filed this report for CNA from Budapest.
Over the last 16 years, since Viktor Orban has been Prime Minister here in Hungary, we've seen a huge increase in Chinese investment across the country, notably in the sectors of green tech and green transport, with battery factories and electric vehicle manufacturing plants. BYD is one of the world's most recognizable names in the sector of EVs, and the Chinese company has seen sales increase here in Hungary, nearly 85% in January and February this year compared to last year. But with the general election coming up in Hungary on the 12th of April, there could be the potential for a change in policy. Domestic issues have been dominating the campaign, but there are certainly international themes that are important as well. If Viktor Orban were to win re-election, it's likely we would see still closer ties between Hungary and China, Hungary and Russia, and Hungary and the United States. But if the opposition TISA party, under their leader Peter Magyar, were to win power, it's likely there would be a repositioning of the connections between Budapest and Beijing, the potential for a more cautious outlook, and the possibility of a loosening of what are currently Hungary's outwardly pro-China policies. For CNA, I'm Ross Cullen in Budapest.
That's your business news this Friday evening. We'll tell you.
Thanks so much for that, Roland. Well, time now for another break. But coming up on East Asia tonight, Chinese President Xi Jinping discusses peace, unity, and future cross-strait ties in a high-profile meeting with Taiwan's opposition leader, Cheng Li-wun. We'll be getting insights on the optics and impact of this rare meeting when we speak with an expert next. Plus, allies China and North Korea pledged to deepen ties during Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Pyongyang. You're watching East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Pakistan is set to host high-stakes talks between the US and Iran, aimed at ending 6 weeks of war. The capital, Islamabad, is under tight security ahead of Saturday's negotiations, now at the center of global efforts for a ceasefire. China's factory prices snap a 3-year deflation streak, signaling that Iran war-driven energy shocks are starting to feed into production costs. And Chinese President Xi Jinping hosts talks with Taiwan's main opposition leader, Cheng Li-wun, both sides stressing the need to maintain peace across the Taiwan Strait, even as Beijing continues to ramp up pressure on the self-ruled island. Now, Ms. Cheng's visit to China is at the invitation of Mr. Xi, and observers view the personal invite as an affirmation of a relationship decades in the making. Well, the current state of relations between Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party can be traced all the way back to a moment in 2005. Well, a meeting in Beijing between then KMT chair Lian Chan and Chinese President Hu Jintao, their handshake marking a shift from decades of hostility to renewed engagement. Well, it was the first such meeting since 1945, when Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong held talks before the Chinese Civil War eventually ruptured ties between two longtime rivals. But a reset 6 decades later. Now, at those talks in 2005, Lian Chan and Hu Jintao agreed on a 5-point consensus, a framework to improve cross-strait ties, and that included support for the 1992 consensus, reflecting a shared understanding of the One China principle. Agreement also to promote stable relations, including steps to reduce the risk of military conflict. And they backed closer economic cooperation, including direct transport links and trade as well. And they also discussed Taiwan participating in international organizations and agreed to establish regular communication. Well, that paved the way for the KMT CPC Forum, an exchange platform held almost annually, bringing members from both parties together to discuss economic and diplomatic issues. And it also led to a landmark agreement in 2010, which reduced barriers to trade across the strait. Now, another breakthrough came in November 2015 at the Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore, a meeting between then Taiwan President and KMT member Ma Ying-jeou and President Xi Jinping, at which Ma emphasized keeping the status quo and Xi that both sides were part of one family. But just months later, a major shift in Taiwan's political landscape. The independence-leaning Democratic Progressive Party, led by Tsai Ing-wen, won a decisive election victory, triggering significant deterioration in cross-strait ties. Well, nonetheless, then KMT chair Hong Xiu-chu and President Xi met later that year, while Ms. Hong reiterating support for the One China framework, while acknowledging that both sides had differing interpretations. Well, official exchanges between the KMT and China have since slowed, and party forums have come to a halt, with cross-strait relations taking a turn for the worse. China has refused to speak to the DPP, labeling current Taiwanese President William Lai a dangerous separatist. But communications have continued with the KMT, those ties cemented by a handshake 2 decades ago, testament to the endurance of diplomacy and dialogue. Well, we certainly have lots to unpack here. So for more insights on these cross-strait relations, we are joined now by Sean King, Senior Vice President at Park Strategies, who has joined us all the way from New York. A very good morning to you, Sean. Thanks for taking the time out to be here with us today. So first up, let's just talk about the significance of this meeting between President Xi and Cheng Li-wun. How much of this meeting do you think is about making diplomatic progress, and how much of it do you think it's about shaping the narrative and shaping the optics?
Well, there's no real diplomatic progress to be made because Cheng Li-wun is just an opposition leader. She does not represent the Taiwan government. And I'm not privy to Xi Jinping's private thinking, nor his own people, because of course we don't have elections in the mainland. But I would think there could be 2 objectives here from Beijing's point of view. There's been a battle within the KMT between a US-centric wing of the party and China-centric wing of the party, which Cheng Li-wun represents. And she's largely out of the mainstream with Taiwan public opinion on cross-strait issues. So this could be Xi's way of elevating her wing within the party and pushing out the more US-friendly wing led by former Taiwan President Ma Ying-jeou. Also, with Trump due to visit Beijing next month and an arms sale pending in the Taiwan legislature, this could be Xi's way of telling Trump, who's already put the arms sale on hold so as not to upset Xi, hey, you don't need to sell these weapons to Taiwan because I'm working with the opposition, which has a majority in the legislature, to stall them anyway. So there could be many motives behind Xi's moves here, but I don't really see much room for diplomacy because, again, Cheng Li-wun does not speak for the government.
Okay, so I hear what you're saying about Beijing's strategy with this right now. But also to highlight, what's pretty striking is that, while Xi was meeting Cheng Li-wun and talking about peace, there were these Chinese warplanes also crossing the median line in Taiwan. So what do you think the message Beijing is trying to send here?
Well, Beijing has been encouraging in Taiwan space and territory going back to the 1950s. This is nothing new. And I liked your little vignette there, looking back at the last 20 years of KMT, CCP interaction. It should be noted at no time has Beijing eased up on Taiwan during those 20 years. And you mentioned the ECFA agreement in 2010 that was signed in goods and trade in goods. When they tried to increase it to a trade in services, that's what led to the downfall of the KMT government, both at the legislature and presidential level. So just as Xi is making nice with Cheng and ignoring Taiwan's own freely elected government, his planes are circling Taiwan, intimidating the people. And I think that that's why this is really going to fall on deaf ears among a lot of people on Taiwan itself.
And Sean, I just want to stay with the symbolism of this because we're not talking about diplomatic progress here, but let's talk about the optics and language of this meeting, especially when Cheng Li-wun, she used General Secretary Xi. And also there's this thing about her invitation for him to visit Taiwan one day. What do you make of that?
Again, she's really out of the mainstream with Taiwan public opinion. She said when she was leading her campaign to become KMT chair, she wants to see a day when people on Taiwan say they're proud to be Chinese. But most opinion polls say only 3% of people on Taiwan exclusively identify as Chinese. She also blamed Ukraine and NATO for Putin's attack on Ukraine, saying Putin's not a dictator because he's a freely elected leader. She also was very fawning and complimentary of Xi on this trip, talking about one Chinese family and praising Xi for rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and talking about, one family across the strait. William Lai, the Taiwan president, he proposes talks with Beijing with no preconditions. So the DPP and Taiwan's ruling government is willing to talk to Beijing. It's just Beijing doesn't want to talk to them. So her invitation to Xi come to Taiwan, that's a nice headline, but the DPP is all ready to talk to Xi Jinping. So that's really nothing new.
So, Sean, let's just widen the lens a little and just talk about to what extent do you think this cross-strait story, that is also a story about Taiwan's own internal political divide over how to deal with Beijing?
Yeah, we always look at everything that happens in Taiwan in terms of cross-strait relations, but a lot of it has to do with the privilege of the KMT and the mainlanders who came over in 1949 and put themselves in positions of power over so-called native Taiwanese, the ethnic Chinese who were already on the island. So this has as much to do with relations within Taiwan as it does across the strait. And this person in particular, Cheng Li-wun, has to do with the battle within the KMT that Xi is now most likely trying to influence by elevating her in a way that he has in others. I mean, receiving her in Beijing, that's a pretty big deal. And we should remember when Ma Ying-jeou met Xi in November 2015, even though he was a lame duck president at the time, 2 months later, his own party was trounced at the polls. Now, there is a sense of DPP fatigue because they've been in power for 10 years, and people aren't sure on Taiwan what to make of Trump. After all, he's held up this arms sale, and he's also denied President Lai a transit stopover in the U.S., but this could be just the kind of thing that backfires on the KMT amidst the Taiwan general public and hurts them at the polls at a later date.
Interesting there. Let's just bring Washington into the picture now. I mean, obviously they're busy with Iran, but, how do you think this meeting is being read, in the U.S. ahead of Trump's meeting with Xi, possibly in mid-May?
Well, there's how the U.S. and the foreign policy establishment reads it, and then there's how Trump himself reads it. Foreign policy establishment of the U.S., traditional U.S. policy would be we encourage any and all dialogue across the Taiwan Strait, not just, though, with opposition parties. We also say that Beijing should be talking openly to Taiwan's freely elected government, which obviously it refuses to do. Trump himself, who knows what he's thinking? He says Taiwan stole our chips. He's put these arms sales on hold. He denied Lai transit stopover in the U.S., as I mentioned last year. And he probably prizes a trade deal with mainland China above all. So I'm not sure how seriously or how much he cares about Taiwan, although in his national defense strategy a few months ago, it did say that the United States would defend the first island chain of which Taiwan is a part. So U.S. is invested in Taiwan's security and standing, although we have no formal commitment to defend the island, as we don't even recognize its government. So U.S. establishment is probably a little concerned that Beijing is not talking directly to Taiwan's government, but what Trump is thinking, only he knows, and that may change from day to day anyway.
All right, many thanks for joining us and helping us make sense of all the signals coming from Beijing and Taipei. Sean King there, Senior Vice President at Park Strategies. Well, in the meantime, China and North Korea have pledged to deepen ties following a visit to Pyongyang by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. The sides agreed to strengthen cooperation, strategic communication, and exchanges across multiple fields. Chinese state media said that Mr. Wang and his North Korean counterpart held an in-depth discussion on international and regional issues, though neither side gave further details. Pyongyang says that maintaining friendly relations with Beijing is a consistent policy. China is North Korea's top trading partner and also a vital source of diplomatic and economic support. Mr. Wang is on his first visit to North Korea in 7 years. Last month, the two neighbors resumed direct flights and passenger train services, which had been suspended due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, Panamanian President José Raúl Mulino is hoping to calm tensions with China, triggered by what he says is a court ruling against Hong Kong-based CK Hutchison. Mr. Mulino speaking at Balboa Port, struck a more conciliatory tone, saying that Panama does not want tensions with Beijing to worsen. His comments come a day after his foreign minister accused China of stepping up checks on Panama-flagged ships. Mr. Mulino, however, said that such inspections are not unusual in global shipping and noted that vessels from Liberia and the Marshall Islands have also faced a similar surge in checks.
Mientras hablamos aquí está en Japón el director de Marina Mercante para este propósito, porque claro que queremos ver la validez, el fundamento de estas detenciones. Las mismas no tienen que ver con retaliaciones políticas. A lo mejor ellos quieren intensificar la revisión de los buques desde el punto de vista de seguridad marítima.
A Panama Supreme Court in January struck down the legal basis for CK Hutchison's long-standing port concessions at Balboa and Cristobal. Well, the move came amid U.S. pressure to limit Chinese influence around the Panama Canal. China called the ruling an act of bad faith, while CK Hutchison says that its property was unlawfully seized by Panama. The port operator is seeking more than $2 billion in damage in an ongoing case against the Central American country. But China has called on Japan to take concrete steps to safeguard the political foundation of its bilateral relations. It comes after Tokyo downgraded its description of Beijing in its 2026 diplomatic blue book.
中日关系当前局面的根源在于日本首相高市早苗发表涉台谬论，背信弃义，损害中日关系的政治基础，挑战战后国际秩序。日方应当恪守中日4个政治文件和自身所作承诺，反思纠错，以实际行动维护中日关系的政治基础。
Japan's annual report now refers to China as a, quote, important neighboring country, compared to the 2025 edition, where Beijing was called, quote, one of the most important bilateral relations. The report added that China has intensified what it calls unilateral criticism and coercive measures against Japan. It pointed to incidents such as radar illumination by Chinese military aircraft targeting self-defense forces planes, as well as export restrictions on dual-use items to Japan. Now, this development comes amid the worst diplomatic spat between Beijing and Tokyo in years. It was triggered by Prime Minister Takaichi in November, when she signaled that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could prompt a military response from Japan. Well, time now for a break. But coming up on East Asia tonight, tensions in the Middle East sending shockwaves across the globe, reaching as far as the Pacific Island nations, where surging fuel costs are putting governments under strain. And we'll speak with an expert after the break to unpack the region's growing energy vulnerability. Now, the war on Iran may be unfolding in the Middle East, but the economic fallout is being felt across the globe. Disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important oil shipping routes, is rattling energy markets and pushing up prices far beyond the Gulf. Pacific Island economies are especially vulnerable due to their heavy reliance on fuel imports. Oil accounts for some 80% of the region's energy needs, powering everything from electricity generation and transport to shipping and essential services. Now, a recent ABC report says that the region is already feeling economic strain, though it's yet to experience widespread fuel shortages. In Fiji, for instance, queues reportedly built up at service stations after sharp fuel price hikes of at least 20% were announced last week due to panic buying. In the Marshall Islands, a 90-day economic emergency has been declared. And in Tuvalu, government workers have even been sent home as authorities try to contain costs. Regional partners are weighing on how to best respond. New Zealand has taken the issue directly to the US, with Foreign Minister Winston Peters urging Washington to ready fuel tankers for the region should the need arise. Australia, meanwhile, says it has been in talks with Pacific nations on how it could help ease the pressure as it stresses its role as a responsible Pacific partner. Well, Pacific ministers and senior officials are due to meet in Vanuatu next week to shape the region's position ahead of a conference on phasing out fossil fuels, a discussion now carrying renewed urgency in the wake of the latest energy shock. Well, for a deeper look at the unfolding situation for the Pacific Islands, we are joined now by Oliver Nobetau, Acting Pacific Islands Program Director at Lowy Institute. Well, thanks, Oliver, for joining us this evening. First up, let's just start with the bigger picture, how most Pacific nations, they rely on imported diesel fuel just to keep the lights on. So what has this Mid-East crisis basically revealed about the deeper dependencies island nations have on global energy security?
Yeah, look, thank you for having me on this evening. And it was a very good question. Now, what it revealed, the Iran conflict, is that it's revealed deep structural vulnerabilities in the energy supply of not just Pacific Island countries, but across many nations. Now, the Pacific countries, though, they feel it more acutely. You know, as you mentioned earlier, most Pacific nations run primarily on diesel generation. So, you know, fuel imports aren't just about transportation. They really underpin basic service delivery, like powering hospitals, water systems, even schools as well. Now, on top of that, being small markets of the Pacific Island countries are, and they're located at the end of global shipping routes, they have very little leverage to outbid competitors for supplies whenever there's a global shortage. So what this shock has done is that the shock is new, but the vulnerabilities that we've seen aren't, right? This is a structural reality for a lot of Pacific Island countries.
So when you look at the economic strain that, you know, this is creating, some vulnerable countries, they may need emergency external support if this shock drags on. So, Oliver, do we know which Pacific Island economies are close or getting close to that point already?
Yeah, look, at the moment, there hasn't been much that's been said about where the help is going to be coming from. I think there's an expectation that Pacific Island countries have to get assistance from all partners, traditional and non-traditional. With this question as well, it's hard to position, for Pacific Island countries, to position themselves in a manner because there's very little correlation between, I guess, global oil supply shortages and their geopolitical alignments. Now, everyone in the world is feeling the pinch right now, but it's going to be hard to get the assistance when other countries as well are focusing on sort of their own national interests and securing their own domestic supplies. Pacific Island leaders, I think, will see, have been experiencing with the meetings that have been coming up at navigating sort of the great power competition in the Pacific, and they're looking about the relationships they can lean on to try and get the support.
So we hear New Zealand, Australia, you know, sort of like offering help in one form or another. But also, how does this moment then, you know, sort of shape perhaps the role that other countries, we're talking about China, South Korea, or Japan, could even play in the Pacific, particularly when it comes to energy and infrastructure support?
Look, that's a really interesting question. Now, I think we can group these and try and answer that in two different ways. Now, for a country like Australia and New Zealand, now they have a well-proven track record of providing assistance to Pacific countries, being geographically located quite close to them. Australia and New Zealand have helped out in times. We've seen that a lot in COVID. We've seen that during natural disasters. They're usually the first on scene to help out. And even in times of debt distress as well. So there's, a track record of reliability and consistency. Now, what form this will take as well is a little bit is yet to be determined, whether or not this is going to be through extra fuel shipments or through budget support to sort of offset the rising costs. But naturally, there will be limits to what partners can offer during times of global stress. But I wouldn't write off the traditional partners in this sense. But there is an opportunity as well, to be frank. If any country can deliver fuel to Pacific nations that are facing this acute shortage right now, it would be a good thing for everyone. For China, it would try and look to leverage the sort of diplomatic gains from providing this assistance. And I think, before, not to speculate too much, we can wait for, I guess, what is delivered first before drawing those conclusions. But for countries like South Korea and even Japan, the picture is a little bit different from China's because they tend to align in terms of their partnership with the traditional partners in the Pacific, like the US, Australia, and New Zealand. So their major concerns will sort of be China's increasingly sort of assertive posturing in the Indo-Pacific. Now, there are greater concerns around them from the Pacific. However, I think the Pacific leaders would welcome any support that they can get at this stage.
Yeah, so to just press you a little bit more on that could this potentially become some kind of a geopolitical turning point? Because, as you mentioned, right, countries that can perhaps offer practical energy, financing, or infrastructure could possibly gain much deeper influence in the Pacific.
Yeah, look, I think that's a good question. Over the last, I guess, a decade, the better half of the decade, there's been a lot of geopolitical interest from major powers and middle powers who are not traditionally in the Pacific. And what this has done for a lot of Pacific countries is it's sort of taught them this art of hedging against each other. But I think what we've sort of come out of over the past few years with a lot of deals that have been signed in the Pacific with the major and middle powers is that there seems to be a lot of footholds where traditional partners like Australia and US are sort of standing quite firm on, in terms of security, development assistance, even governance as well. There's only a few other places where you could it could lead to a geopolitical turning point. Now, I will say that oil and sort of the oil supply and what that means for energy security as well will be a significant factor, although I think it's a little bit too early right now to tell whether or not this will mark the start of a geopolitical turning point.
And what about the development, on the development finance side of things? Because the Asian Development Bank, for instance, it's a major player in the Pacific. Do you have a wish list for the ADB right now, and what would be at the top of that list?
Yeah. Look, a wish list, that's a good question. I think the ADB, you're right, they're a major player. ADB, Australia, they do a lot in the Pacific. I think that their current priorities as well are good. One thing I wouldn't like to see is that development funding is moved away from what it's already addressing, because it already goes to significant projects in health and education and infrastructure governance as well for a lot of these partners. So I would like to see, if it was a wish list, to see added finance going in, as you said, for development finance, and using that to try and prop up Pacific Island countries.
A really important perspective there from you. Thanks so much for joining us, Oliver Nobetau, Acting Pacific Islands Program Director at Lowy Institute. And on that note, we wrap up Friday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at CNA.Asia. Thanks for watching.